Hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Talty, and I am the author of Night of the Living Rez, which just came out this past July from Tin House. I am an assistant professor of English at the University of Maine, Orono, and I'm from the Penobscot Indian Nation in Maine.
Hey, I'm Tyler. My book, Eternal Night at the Nature Museum. Oh, great. It's getting blurred out. There we go. Eternal Night at the Nature Museum. It's a book of short stories that came out last November from Saraban Books, and it is my debut collection. I live in the Adirondack Park of upstate New York, and I work for the Adirondack Center for Writing as the communications manager. And I also, through the Adirondack Center for Writing, teach writing workshops for the incarcerated elderly here in Raybrook, New York. My book is called Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, and that is a edited title of one of the pieces in the book. Actually, I think the shortest piece in the book, the title story is called Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, a half hour downriver from 3 Mile Island. And it's like a one-page prose poem that I feel like has it sets up a lot of the themes of the book about finding home in places where you wouldn't expect to find home, and is also it's set in a nature museum. I think that my book is a little misleading because there's an image of a nature museum on the front. The word nature museum is there. I've worked in nature museums a lot of my adult life, but there's actually maybe 12 pages of this book that are set in nature museums. So there is another story that's called Iowa Darter that is all about a man helping young children in a nature museum to learn about the wildlife. And then there's that little flash that's set in a nature museum. But besides that, there's not a ton of stories that are set there. But I also like I think we liked the idea of the title referring to everything can be a museum if you look at it closely, that kind of idea. I think there's a lot of really specific details in all the stories having to do with animals and nature and setting and place that kind of my hope is to uh, use literature as a way of seeing the world and all of its details as important and worthy of reflection. So I think that's kind of my idea behind it. I'm not sure a lot of people get that from the title, but it's also fairly catchy as long as you don't get it confused with that movie with Ben Stiller, which has happened. So, lesson learned. But
So, Night of the Living Rez is kind of, I feel like I can talk about it in the same way Tyler talked about his title. Mine is also sort of a misleading title. I think people, when they hear it, are quick to think of, oh, this is going to be about zombies. Um, and in, I think, metaphorical ways, the book is about zombies and the undead, or what it means to be alive, what it means to be sort of not alive. But I got the title. I'd had the story Night of the Living Rez, which is one of the final stories. That was actually the first story I wrote for the whole book, and I wrote that in 2015. And the original title of the book was The Little Yellow House, which was like this title that I had had for years and years and years when I first started writing. A former mentor was like, this phrase appears over and over again in your work. Maybe it's the title for your collection, which is something different from this. So I was like, oh, sure, I'll title it that. And it was titled that all the way until like 2017, when a mentor and now a good friend was like, I think you should title this Night of the Living Rez. And I was like, okay. And I just did. I just was like, I'll go with Night of the Living Rez because he was like, if I saw that title in a bookstore, I would, have a double take at it and be like, oh, I want to read this. So I did. Horror fans are horrified because when they read it, they're like, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with zombies. There's like a reference later on, but yeah, I tricked people into thinking it was something it was not. But for the most part, I think people who didn't expect what it was about still enjoyed it. So
yeah, I'll add in that there's like 6 versions of this book before the final version that was accepted. I was submitting it over about 2 years, and it never did it have this title until Sarah Ban accepted the book. They actually accepted the book with a different title, which was another story from the book, Where the Rubies Live. And I was trying to do a Carmen Maria Machado thing, and it was Where the Rubies Live and Other Homes, because all of the stories are about like leaving home or finding home or losing home, which I thought was clever, but they just didn't think was, wasn't quite right. So we workshopped a lot, and then we kind of came to this together. So I credit Kristen Miller, my editor at Saraband, with this idea.
Yeah, I have to credit Aaron Hamburger, my mentor and friend and writer, who told me to title it this. We actually talked because there is like a lot of conversations about writers who get their books accepted and then their title ends up changing. Because editorially they're like, oh, or sales, we want to put it this way. And I think there was one like mention about the title at Tin House, but nobody like wanted to change it. But I'm curious now. I'm gonna have to ask them what they thought if they couldn't have titled it this, what they would have titled it, or
Yeah.
would have liked to seen it titled as. That'd be interesting. Yeah, I think my approach to writing, contemporary America or contemporary, insert any space or place, is to really think about the people who populate it, and to think about the setting that is, both at the backdrop of their lives, but also influencing and affecting their lives. For me, I cared deeply about character emotion, and thinking and trying to figure out, okay, we can have a series of events unfold, but how are those series of events enhanced and or complemented by an arc that is emotion, thinking about how we move from happiness to sadness, how we go down really dark alleys in fiction, but how do we come out of it? I think I've always liked this Jane Austen quote. I think it was Jane Austen, one does not love a place the less for having suffered in it unless it's been all suffering and nothing but suffering. So I always try to get at that first part of her quote, thinking about, how do we suffer in a place, but how do we still love it? Why do we still love it? How do we still care for these people who have, done these injustices? And so for me, that's really what I try to focus on. I'm also very much like against being super specific about like world events in my fiction. I don't know why. I think because I fear if I give it a time marker, it'll become stuck to that moment. And so I think in my work, it's very vague about time and timelines and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I wonder, Morgan, is that the epigraph of the book, the Jane Austen quote?
It is not, no, but yeah, it probably could have been.
Okay. I kind of, that reminded me that I have an epigraph and that's actually on this same topic, so I wanted to share that too. The epigraph of the book is by Mary Robeson, who's a writer mostly known for short stories, but also wrote a very cool novel called Why Did I Ever? She's I believe, a Southern writer. It's from her story In Jewel, and the sentence is, I like feeling at home, but I wish I didn't feel it here. And I think the story with my book, and the reason that all of these stories ended up, there's 20 stories in the book and they're all in some way about home. And we tried to divide the book in terms of people. Like the first section of the book are people who have left home already or are searching for a new home and find it in a really strange place. Like the first story, character begins living at a demolition derby. And then there are stories in the middle of people deciding to leave home and trying to do this like stay or go. Should I live here? Should I live somewhere else? Where do I fit in? And then the third is people nearer to the end of their life kind of settling into an ideal of home wherever they are, and like trying to construct home on, they don't really have a choice to go somewhere else. And I never set out to try to write stories about that. I just, started pulling all of the stories that I thought were the strongest, and I was trying really hard to find what it was that connected them. And it took a while for this to kind of rise up out of the book, but it honestly was reading that. I think it was 2017 or 18. I was reading Mary Robeson's book and came across this story. It's very short. It's called In Jewel, and it's about someone living in a really small town in West Virginia and teaching high school, and whether or not really she should leave her position in this town that is like threatened by all kinds of things. There's like a lot of problems with the mine in town, but also like rocks that are balancing like near the tops of hills that could roll down into the town. And I don't know, it's such a beautiful story, and it made me realize that I had been writing about home ever since I left home. I grew up in southern Pennsylvania, in the country, and I went to college not far from there. And I worked then in that same town after I graduated from college, but never really left home, never more than 40 minutes away. And when I first did go to college, my parents also got separated like the first year that I left, and the home that I had kind of taken for granted most of my life, disappeared in a way, and the house was sold. And so I was thinking a lot about home and realizing too that I could write about the places I was from after I had left them. So when I went to Minnesota to work on my MFA, I found myself writing all these stories about southern Pennsylvania that I wasn't writing when I was there. I was also a younger writer when I was writing stories and living in southern Pennsylvania, but I was always thinking, oh, I can set a story anywhere. I can just like pick a place on the map that sounds interesting and we'll just put it there so that it's weird, or so that it's like surprising, and like had no sense of like what I was trying to do as a writer. And then when I left, I found that I had no choice but to write about the place that I was from, and I wanted to tell those stories. So a lot of the stories in this book are set in like Gettysburg, York, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the places where I've lived. And they try to show the people that I recognize. There are stories that are set in other places I visited and lived for a short time, but often they're small towns, they're overlooked places, and people who are trying to decide whether or not the home where they were born is their home, or if they can make a new one in some way. So yeah, I think that probably answers the question. That's what I'm trying to get at with home in my book. But um, as far as like an attempt to represent any kind of American identity, I really just focus a lot on working class characters and characters who are moving in between places. They're transient, or they're not sure where they fit in the world. And I don't know, I never sit down to try to write that. It's just the way that it comes out.
Yeah, I think humor is such an essential part of any type of dark fiction, or any type of story, or any type of life really that has an element of suffering to it. I've heard it said before that, if you can make somebody laugh, you can have them, they'll follow you anywhere. And growing up, fiction was always, not fiction, humor was always like a sort of a coping mechanism with trauma and the horrors that occur, and can occur in day-to-day life. I just remember laughing at things that are completely, you know you shouldn't have laughed at them, or it's like, how could you laugh after that happened? But it's always been a form of medicine in a way. And in my own fiction, I think, I looked for, I really asked myself, okay, if I were in these characters' shoes, like, where would I laugh? Like, where would I, say something that um felt it would alleviate some of the pain that was accompanying the stories and the characters. And so, I think it's all about opportunity, right? It's like, I never try to set out to be funny, because I feel like the moment you do that, you fail at it, unless you're like David Sedaris or somebody who's like really good at using, humor. But um, you know, writing a dark story for so long will only carry itself for so long in the reader. And then eventually, to me, it becomes sort of this like that's its appeal, only is that it is horrific. But really, I don't think that does anything. I think the humor, is this like medicinal element, trying to find an opportunity to say something funny, or an opportunity to interject a very, high tense moment with something that a character does, that could be outrageous, is just essential. Because one, it's very sort of, the reader needs it to give them the energy to keep going on. But it's also sort of realistic in a way that I think most people cope with trauma and bad situations with humor eventually at some point.
Yeah, I think about this a lot in terms of when writing is funny and when writing has jokes in it. And I do think that sometimes I write jokes in my stories, and more often than not, a joke that's written in a draft will get cut at some point if it's clear that it was like me trying to make a punchline, like something that would have worked on Twitter, I'm trying to insert into a story, which my brain is always trying to do, but is usually not healthy. But what I think in my work that's often funny, and in the work that I love the most that's funny, and almost all of my favorite writers do use humor in some ways. It's not like a setup and punchline. It's just choosing to let the right details be on the page to describe a situation. I I remember like growing up and really loving stand-up comedians, but watching so much stand-up comedy, but not analyzing joke structure, which I'm still not even sure I have a handle on. It's more like the way that a perfect word choice would make me realize that someone else had seen the world in the way that I'd seen it. And that was like, a lot of times, even like a setup, like, hey, have you ever noticed that people do this? It's like, I would be just like, yes, I have noticed that. Or yes, I would describe it in that way. And it's almost like the punchline that would come is nice. And it would make me laugh. But like, I was always fascinated more by just like somebody sharing a really specific detail or finding the right word to describe it. A comedian I loved growing up was Brian Regan, and I think because he was like a clean comic too, but he had just such great word choice. And of course, I'm not going to be able to pull any great ones, but yeah, word choice and then specific details. I think that's what can make writing funny. I don't think it's wrong to have like a joke in your story, but especially if it's like delivered in a way that's believable. I like when characters are talking back and forth, and all conversation has that element of like improvisational, like riffing. I love to see that captured on the page. Some of my favorite writers do that. But yeah, if I ever find myself trying to shoehorn in a good joke, it's usually a recipe for disaster. So I guess that's what I can say about it.
Yeah, it also would end up cutting a joke. I don't think I've ever tried it. If I've tried a joke, it's like failed miserably, and I've never tried it again.
Yeah, right. With that said, there are like two or three jokes in the book that if I talk to someone who's read the book, like that usually get reference, and I'm always so happy that they're appreciated. But I think that's also probably because there isn't a ton of those kind of like easy to crop out like jokes that could work in another context. They're few and far between, so I think they stand out to people in a good way. But I'll admit this collection is the sixth or seventh iteration of what was my thesis project for my MFA at Minnesota State University, Mankato. So I turned in a story collection for that, and a lot of the same stories appear in this book. So that was in 2018, and then over the course of the next 2 years, I continued to work on the book. Went to a very foundational for me. It was my first writing residency, which was here in the Adirondacks through the Adirondack Center for Writing, which I now work for. That's how much I love the residency. But it helped me to finish a version of the book, and then that's when I started submitting and sent the book out some places. But really, it was kind of what might be seen as the backwards way of making a book. Was like I was writing disparate stories and then sat with a lot of material and tried to figure out if I had a book here. I mean, there are 200 and some pages in Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, about 20 stories in it. But honestly, I had a very, very productive like 5 year period from like 2015 to even I was still writing a lot of stories after grad school and even until the book came out, because a few were snuck in late too, up to like 2020. Just I had probably had 80 stories I could choose from, but I really wanted to pick ones that made sense to put together. And I also wanted the book to be representative of the varying lengths of short stories that I write. Not simply to be like, look at all these different kinds of story. I can write prose poetry, I can write flash and longer stories, but because like that is what I'm reading all of the time. I love to read short story collections, but I also am very into flash. I'm very into poetry and into a longer 30-page short story too. So it's just kind of compendium of all of my interests as a reader, and was hoping to find I'm thankful to find other readers who respond to that as well, where one story is 20 pages and then the next one sits on a single page and then the next one's 5 pages, and the book has all these different lengths of stories, and it shows different things that I was trying to do as I was learning to write, but they've also been all revised really heavily and worked on with editors at various literary journals where they were published first, and then with Kristen again with Saraban. So I feel that the collection is cohesive in voice and tone and style, but yeah, the stories take all kinds of shapes and sizes and formal structures too.
Yeah, I feel like my book exists on accident in a way. I So the first story, Native Living Rez, I wrote in 2015, that I think I mentioned that. And between then and starting in my MFA program in 2017, I had written maybe a couple other stories from David's point of view, the main character in the book. And it wasn't until I went into my MFA that I was like, oh, I'll write a story collection. Like that was, what I think I wanted to do. And I was like, well, I have these stories from David's point of view. And, I was like, how about I write, a story collection where we move in time from David as a young boy all the way till David is sort of like a young man in Night of the Living Rez. And I was like, all right, that'll be the framework I use. And so I did that. I wrote like 14 or 15 stories told from David's point of view. And I looked at it all together and I was like, this is really bad. Like it just was, for a story collection that has the same character over and over again, there has to be some type of connection, I guess. And I felt like age wasn't the thing. Like I feel like you would get bored of it really quickly, because if you pick up a traditional story collection, like, you read a story and then the next one, it can be completely different characters, completely different place. But this one was the same place, same characters, just different situations and emotions. And so I was like, well, whatever, I'll just go do something else. And so I wrote the story Burn, and it was Burn where I found D as a character. And then I was like, is this David all grown up? And I was like, it is. And I was like, well, what happened? And then that changed my entire perspective of the story collection. I was like, all right, this has come back to life, this project I was doing. And so I started writing all of these D and Fella stories, like Burn, Get Me Some Medicine, Earth Speak, Half-Life, and plenty more that didn't make it into the book. And I started to see this connection emerge that I don't think so. My approach is like, I like to think that I have some control over where the story's going, but then I feel like story as like an actual entity that exists, that would exist without us even, being here, being, alive. It is communicating to us in ways that we have to sort of like listen to. And so like in my mind, whenever a story is resisting, whenever it's like not wanting to work, that's me not paying attention to what the story wants, so that may mean I have to cut a character, that may mean I have to cut 2 pages, that may mean I have to start over. And so when I got to this point where I had these D and David stories, I was like, okay, I'm going to see how much this story as a whole will let me do. And I found this structure, and then I found this underlying theme, or this underlying question of what happened. And I found myself not able to turn it into a broader arc. The more I tried, agents had been like, oh, if you turn this into a novel, I think we can sell it. And I tried to turn it into a novel. I tried to make there be this overarching narrative, but the more pressure I applied in that way, the more the stories began to break, the more the more that they they just stopped working. And so I was like, well, it's not going to be a novel, I can't do it, it's going to have to be this other thing. And the story collection with this subtle, what happened, while still maintaining, all of the stories as standalone pieces. And I, I looked for moments where I could, where I could suggest that arc, but not really implicate the stories in a broader one. And so, like, for example, in Safe Harbor, near the end, there's this, accident that D experiences with his leg. And then later on, in Earth Speak, for example, Fellis, asks D, he's like, I want you to drive or something. And D's like, I hate driving. And he's like, I scratched my leg. And like these subtle moments that, connected the stories, not, by actual like action, but by like implied reference. And that was how I found the book to work. Was not giving in to this like overwhelming urge to make it into a big book that is like all connected, but really playing on what is left out of the stories to try to get the most power. And so writing the book and the whole process of it was really just like me fumbling around with what I thought I could get to work, and then ultimately realizing, oh, I could not do that, or that I can't get it to work. I'm not, the story wants it to go in an entirely different direction.
Yeah, I love that idea of like the way stories can connect with smaller associations or moments or references. I was noticing that this weekend I was reading a collection by Catherine Lacey called Certain American States. And there's like such a great like echo of like image after image to kind of daisy chain the stories together. And I definitely tried to do that a bit with the structure of my book. Like there's a lot of stories, so we broke them into like three categories of like what was the main narrative arc or narrative idea behind those stories. I talked a little bit about that earlier, but then within those three sections, there's still about 6 or 7 stories. So finding order was sometimes like, the first story in the collection ends with a bunch of people raising their hands in the air. And then the very next story is the story about a music producer trying to find the perfect clap. So bringing people into a music studio and they're all clapping their hands. So it's like the hands go from story to story. And then there's a couple more moments like that where there's a really nice little pattern to bring you from one story to the next, because the story, especially I'm not working with any linked characters or many linked places at all. It really is a total jump or like a whiplash from story to story. So there's some things to do to soften that break a little bit.
Yeah, and that's such an important part, I think, of storytelling in general, is thinking about the pattern of a story, thinking about its logic, but then also thinking in the broader way of, how they fit together. Like you said, to alleviate that, that whiplash of moving from one story to the next. I find that, I think like again, returning to the Aaron Hamburger who told me to title my book this, he's like, life is random, art is pattern. And it's like thinking about, okay, well, if I'm going to make this happen, how do I make it so it feels real? Like, how do I, like, it can't just unexpectedly burst onto the page, or maybe it can if you can get away with it. But, it's, I think writing really is really is concerned with rewriting and rethinking and reshaping, where you've sort of already written from.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so Tyler, here is the writing assignment prompt. Using any point of view, put 2 characters in a setting. In that setting, place an item they both want. Who, if either of them, walks away with the item?
All right. I've got that. Oh, thank you for putting that in the chat too. Great.
Yeah.
So my prompt is, it requires you first to go to this website, which is randomcolor.com. It's just going to give you a random color on the hex spectrum. So there's lots of different ones. I like to say, you can get one refresh, but you're pretty much stuck with what you get. So then there's really just 3 small parts to this. When I do this in a workshop or class, we kind of go through one by one, but I'm just going to type them in the chat here. The first would be to describe the color for someone who can't see it. 2 would be to free write any associations, ideas, memories, or other works of art, etc. Do that probably for a little bit longer, maybe 5 minutes. And then the last thing is to try to name the color. And I'll sometimes twist this too, to be like, name the color from your perspective. Like, what if you were working for Sherwin-Williams, what would you name this paint color? But also you could do it from a character's perspective. So if you're working on a story and you want this to, an exercise to fit in to give you a fresh perspective on a character, maybe think about how they would respond to that color, what they would name it if they were working for it. And the only other thing I'll say is that it's really fun to just like get some paint swatches. I don't know if you can see these or not, and do this like at a group with like a bunch of people, and then also have them try to like read their piece about their color, and then have the group guess, what color they're talking about. This is everything from like a totally introductory writing workshop to something that I like to do with writers who have been writing for years and years too, because it kind of goes back to the basics of like, how do you describe a color? And everyone sees it differently. So yeah, so I know that's kind of a lot, but get your color, and then, oh, right, the third was to name it. So any questions, Morgan?
No, I think I'm all set.
Okay.
So describe the color for someone who can't see it, and then free write any associations, ideas, and memories. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, and then whatever you want to do with that, that's just a way to gather material. There's often like an extension that's like, now revise the piece to make that name the title of it, and use whatever you actually liked from what you wrote. But I don't need to over explain. You know what you're doing. So
Yeah.
okay. Cool.
All right. So I'll set mine for
10. Yeah, I want to thank you for this, because I've been working on a short story. I was actually reading over parts of it this morning, and I think that this activity, I decided to just, since my mind was already on that story, to apply the prompt to the characters in that story. So, and actually, I'm going back to writing about nature museums again, but there is two characters who work at a nature museum where, to make extra money during the holidays, the museum is doing laser light shows in the planetarium. And the object between them is that neither of the workers, the people who are working that night, want to have to sit in and watch the Pink Floyd laser light show, because they've seen it so many times and it is truly awful. And they're complaining about not wanting to be the one who has to go in and babysit the audience inside the Pink Floyd show, because people often try to stand up and touch the ceiling because they're like stoned and stuff. So this scene, I didn't think of it before. I had this scene of these characters talking outside of the movie theater, but this does add tension to what I was writing, was them kind of trying to convince the other one that they should be the one that has to go in, and why they don't want to be that person. And then what I found was actually that they decide, sorry, I'm not going to read from the piece just because it's too messy, but they find like the third option, which is that neither of them goes in. And then I think that because one has convinced the other that, like, if they don't do this, I'll show you how to feed some of the animals that you don't know how to feed. So they're going to like go get the pinkies to feed the snakes. And so they're doing this, and now it's set up this cool thing where now there's no one watching what's happening inside the planetarium. And that wasn't part of the story before, but now I can see how, because they've made this decision for neither of them to go in, that something wrong can go in there, and then they have to solve that problem together. So it's like, in 10 minutes, it's like 3 little like plot points popped up for me just for having this prompt. And I like basically just wrote notes about those as I went. And it's really helpful, because plot is the thing that I am the worst at, and this, like, not the way my brain is set up. I just want to create moments that are interesting, like little moments and little I don't know. I love the smaller stuff of stories, the details and the moments and the things happening on the page, and not necessarily like X leads to Y leads to Z because of this. So this is helping me to do that for sure. So I'm pretty excited.
glad you find it helpful. I like prompts like the one I gave you, but I also I actually lean more towards prompts like the one
Mm,
that's less sort of like prescriptive in what you have to do. This one, so just, I mean, I can go through what I for the three things. So
sure.
the so I won't name the color. I spent a very long time trying to write a sentence that would like use some sort of like simile or whatever. I could not really get it to work, but so the balloon floated away, rising higher in the sky until you could no longer see it. The color of the skin of an eggplant shrinking towards space. So it was like, so I got like a purple color, and it just instantly reminded me of like the eggplant skin. And if it were a paint, I'd name it eggplant glaze. I think would be pretty accurate. And so I liked the color. And for the free write associations, I had obviously eggplant equals balloon for some reason, I think, because they're both round.
Mm,
And then another thing that came to mind was this book by Mark Doty called, I think it's called The Still Life of Oysters and Lemons. And he like looks at um, objects and like writes about them and stuff. But the big thing I took away from this was, the color obviously reminded me of eggplant, but it also reminded me of Sunday dinners in the summer when I would stay with my father, because he rented a room in a house that I called them grandma and grandpa, and their daughter lived next door, and their daughter's daughter lived next door. And so there were these three houses in Connecticut, and they all rented rooms out to people. And so there were always a lot of people around, and they would all come to this Sunday dinner. And one of the meals that they always had was breaded and fried eggplant, thin, cut really thin, breaded and then fried. Sometimes they would bake it, and there'd be a sauce, and everybody ate it either by itself or they put it on these Portuguese rolls that they got from down the street at this corner store. And it was just like I've never had eggplant like that ever since. And it's been so long. But I've been working on an essay collection of like memoir pieces. And so I hadn't thought about these Sunday dinners until now. And so your prompt has given me something to something to add to my to-do list for the
Yeah,
collection.
that's lovely to hear. That is what I love most about writing workshops, is like just providing enough to help someone kind of stir their brain up and then seeing what comes out. And so often with any population, if it's younger kids, if it's the elderly, if it's a group of writers who they've been doing writing prompts, they're kind of like, they know how writing prompts work and stuff. Even doing something like the color thing can always get comments of people being like, I haven't thought about X in so long, or I totally forgot that I had this memory. It's like, that's the magic of really writing in general. And I love a community workshop, or like a workshop with a group of people, and to hear those stories coming out, because the brain is, it's a mysterious place, and you don't know like what equation you need to put in to have a memory like spit out that you haven't thought of. Or and those memories are so exciting too, because a lot of times if you haven't thought about it before, it's not affected by that idea where like every time you remember something, you change it a little bit, and you might also make it into something that fits more neatly into your worldview or something. Like the first time you remember something, it's so fresh and kind of more honest. So I'm glad to hear that, because yeah, I think that's what it's all about. But that said, I do like a prescriptive prompt too, because it does make me work hard and think about how to solve the problem of the prompt, and that can really lead to some very fruitful things with writing. I just love to remind fiction writers to like take a prompt that you get in a workshop, and don't think like, well, this won't be anything because I'm already working on my novel project. Like, make that prompt work for you in the thing that you're working on.
Yeah, no, you never know what's going to turn into, something. I'm thinking of, who was it, Cormac McCarthy, who wrote, I think he was talking about The Road, the road, that the novel he wrote. And he, like years and years before he actually wrote the book, he was in a hotel in Texas and was way up high, had a room way up high, and he was with his son, and his son was sleeping, and he just looked out at the city, and I guess he wrote like a page or something, just describing it and thinking about it as like what this place would look like if, you know, the world had ended in a sense. And then like 5 or 6 years later, he found that, and that was like the start of the road in a way. You know, it became his way into the project. So I always like, I save every piece of writing I do just in the event that it will lead me to something.
Absolutely. I'm the same way. I have a huge folder, or I have a folder on my desktop that is contains more documents than any other folder, and it's called abandoned, but it's like every single thing I've written, because then I can search my computer. Like, I know I wrote about a Pez dispenser somewhere and it was amazing. So just search that and find these old documents, but you just never know.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. This is really fun. It was great to meet Morgan, and thanks for Fall for the Book for doing this. I am Tyler Barton, and my book is Eternal Night at the Nature Museum, and it's from Saraban Books. It came out late last year, and you can get it wherever books are sold. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll echo what Tyler said. Thank you all for, you know, showing up tonight and listening to us. Tyler, it's great to talk with you. Great to meet you. I'm the author of Night of the Living Rez, which just came out from Tin House this past July. And like Tyler's book, you can get it wherever books are sold. Thank you.